in. This one is going to take a while. Nathan Reed had buried one woman and survived another. The first was his mother, who died when he was 11, leaving behind a house full of silence and a father who never quite recovered. The second was Clara Whitfield, the woman he'd courted for 2 years, the woman who'd smiled at his face and stolen half his equipment money before disappearing west with a traveling merchant in the spring of 1882. After Clara, Nathan made himself a promise. He was done with women who had ideas. He was done with women who wanted things. He wanted peace. He wanted order. He wanted someone who would keep the house, set the table, and let him run his farm the way he'd always run it, alone, quiet and without argument. It wasn't cruelty. It was experience. At 40 years old, Nathan Reed had 800 acres of wheat along the Platte River, a reputation for honest dealing, and absolutely no patience left for complication. He was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, a man built by labor and shaped by loss. His workers respected him. His neighbors trusted him. And every woman in Larimer County had long since stopped looking his way because Nathan Reed, they all agreed, didn't actually want a wife. He wanted a housekeeper he didn't have to pay. He would have disputed that. He would have been wrong. When his foreman, a red-haired Irishman named Declan Moore, found him staring at the matrimonial agency advertisement in the back of a 2-week-old newspaper. Declan leaned against the barn door and folded his arms. "You sure about this, boss? I'm sure I'm tired of eating my own cooking." "That's not what I asked." Nathan folded the paper. "It's a practical matter. I need someone to run the household. Agency screens them. It's efficient." Declan looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to fill out a form describing the woman you want to marry." "I already did." Declan's eyebrows climbed his forehead. "And what did you write?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He walked to the desk in the corner of the barn office, a battered oak thing covered in ledgers and seed invoices, and picked up his copy of the letter he'd sent. He read it without expression. "I am a wheat farmer of good standing and reasonable income. I require a wife who is mild-tempered, industrious, and content with domestic life. I am not a man given to long conversation or social entertainment. I do not require beauty or education. I require reliability and a quiet nature. Women with strong political opinions or aspirations beyond household management need not apply." Declan read it over Nathan's shoulder. When he finished, he straightened up and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "Nathan, don't. I'm just going to say, I said don't, Declan." Declan pressed his lips together. Then very quietly, "You know what my mother would have said if my father wrote something like that about her? Your mother would have set the letter on fire. And she would have been right to." Nathan put the paper down. "That's exactly the kind of woman I'm not looking for." Tut-tut. Eleanor Hayes arrived on a Tuesday in late May, 3 weeks after Nathan received the agency's confirmation letter. He drove the wagon to Laramie himself, not because he was eager, but because it seemed like the decent thing to do. She'd traveled from Missouri by rail and then by stage, and the least he could do was meet her at the depot. He recognized her immediately, though he couldn't have said why. There were 4 women stepping off the stage that afternoon, and Eleanor was not the youngest, not the prettiest, and not the one who looked around with any obvious interest in her surroundings. She was the one who stood still. While the other passengers gathered their things and looked for faces in the crowd, Eleanor Hayes set down her 2 trunks, straightened her brown dress, and simply waited. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly. Her hands were folded in front of her. She had the bearing of someone who had learned very thoroughly how to take up as little space as possible. Nathan climbed down from the wagon and walked toward her. "Miss Hayes." "Mr. Reed." Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm. Even. "You have your things. 2 trunks, both here." He lifted them into the wagon without asking if she needed help. She didn't seem to want any, and they drove the 30 miles back to the farm without exchanging more than a dozen words. He told her the arrangement. She nodded. He told her about the house. She nodded. He told her there were 2 ranch hands who took meals in the kitchen on Sundays. She nodded. When they pulled up to the farmhouse, she climbed down before he could offer his hand, looked at the house for exactly 3 seconds, and carried one of her own trunks inside. Declan was watching from the barn. He caught Nathan's eye and raised both eyebrows. Nathan shook his head once. "Don't." Declan grinned and disappeared into the dark of the barn. For the first 2 weeks, Eleanor was everything Nathan had asked for. She cooked, she cleaned. She kept the house in a kind of effortless order that Nathan, who had been managing on his own for 4 years, found disorienting in the best possible way. Meals appeared on time. Laundry was done without him thinking about it. The kitchen, which had been a disaster of mismatched crockery and stacked papers, became a clean and functional room again. She said very little. At dinner, Nathan talked about the fields, the weather, the upcoming harvest. Eleanor listened. Occasionally, she asked a quiet question. "What kind of wheat? When was the last rotation?" He answered briefly, not really thinking about it. He began to relax. He began to think that perhaps he had made a very wise decision. And then, 17 days after Eleanor arrived, she spoke at dinner. "The northeast field," she said between one bite and the next. Nathan looked up. "Pardon, the northeast field. About 40 acres of it, the section closest to the creek." She set down her fork. "How long has the stalks in that section been showing yellow tips?" Nathan stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I walked the perimeter this morning. The wheat in that section is yellowing from the top. It's early yet, but the pattern concerns me." Nathan set down his own fork. "You walked the perimeter of the northeast field. I walk every morning. I find it helpful to understand the land." There was a silence. "Miss Hayes." "Mrs. Reed," she corrected mildly. He blinked. "Eleanor." "Yes. What made you think why would you walk the fields?" She looked at him directly, not aggressively, not defensively, simply directly, the way a person looks at someone when they're trying to understand whether the other person is genuinely confused or just startled. "Because I live here," she said. "And because the northeast field is 40 acres of your best rotation wheat, and if there's something wrong with it, it seems worth knowing." Nathan went to the northeast field the next morning. He walked it himself. Boots wet with dew, moving row by row through the tall wheat, and he looked at the tips. He found nothing. Or rather, he found very little. A handful of stalks here and there yellowing slightly easily, explained by 100 different things. Soil variance, drainage, a dry week. He came back and told Eleanor she'd been mistaken. She nodded as though she'd expected that answer. "All right," she said. "It's probably just dry section near the creek bank." "All right?" He waited for her to argue. She didn't. He waited for her to look resentful. She didn't. She simply turned back to the bread she was kneading and said nothing else. And somehow, that bothered him more than an argument would have. The following Sunday, his 2 ranch hands, a young man named Cody and an older one named Hatch, came in for their weekly meal. Hatch was 52, a weathered man who had been farming in Wyoming since before it was organized as a territory. He knew wheat the way other men knew horses. He could read a field, like some men read a newspaper. Eleanor set the plates down and refilled the coffee and said nothing for most of the meal. Then Hatch mentioned the northeast field. "Been meaning to ask you about that section, Mr. Reed. Saw some yellowing out there Thursday." Nathan looked up sharply. "You saw it too." "Just a few stalks, probably nothing. But the pattern..." Hatch frowned. "Reminds me a little of something I saw up in Nebraska about 15 years back. Started the same way." "What was it?" Cody asked. Hatch shook his head slowly. "Took out 60% of the crop by October." The table went quiet. Nathan became aware in that moment that Eleanor was standing very still at the far end of the kitchen. She had not turned around. She was not smiling. She wasn't doing anything visible at all. But he felt her not saying something so loudly it was almost like speech. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. Her expression was neutral. You said you noticed the same thing. I did. What do you think it is? A pause. Not a hesitation, more like a decision being made. I think it could be a fungal infection. Early stage. The pattern of spread from a moisture-heavy section like the creek bank is consistent with several types of grain blight. Hatch was staring at her. Cody's fork had stopped midway to his mouth. What would you recommend? Nathan heard himself ask. Eleanor walked to the table. She sat down, which she had never done before during a working meal, and she looked at Nathan steadily. Separate the affected rows immediately. Burn the worst of them before the infection can move laterally. Check every field within a half-mile perimeter. And if you have contact with any of the neighboring farms, warn them now, not after you're certain, but now while there's still time to act. The kitchen was very quiet. Hatch looked at Nathan. His expression said something that his mouth didn't. She's right. Nathan cleared his throat. How do you know this? My father was an agricultural scientist. I grew up in his work. After he died, I managed the farm for 3 years before my brother came of age to take it. She paused. I know wheat, Mr. Reed. I've known it most of my life. Nathan didn't act immediately. He told himself he was being careful, that he needed more evidence, that one woman's opinion, however confidently expressed, wasn't enough to justify burning 40 acres of crop. He waited 4 more days. On the 5th day, Hatch came to him at dawn, his face gray. Boss, you need to come see the northeast field. Nathan saw it. The yellowing had spread. What had been a handful of stalks was now an irregular creeping mass of sick wheat moving outward from the creek bank in exactly the lateral pattern Eleanor had described. He stood in that field for a long time. He thought about the 4 days he'd waited. He thought about the quiet, even way Eleanor had told him what she saw. Not demanding, not pleading, just saying it the way you'd say something that was simply true. He walked back to the house. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She looked up when he came in. I need your help, he said. It cost him something to say it. Not a lot, but something. She simply nodded. Tell me exactly what to do. And she did. What followed was 2 weeks of brutal work. Eleanor directed the separation of the infected rows with a precision that made Hatch's eyes widen on the first day. She moved through the fields herself, marking stalks, calculating burn patterns, giving instructions to Cody and Hatch with a quiet authority that neither man questioned, for reasons neither of them could quite explain. Cody told Nathan afterward that it was the clearest set of instructions he'd ever been given. Hatch said nothing, which from Hatch meant more. Nathan worked beside his men and beside his wife, and he watched her. She never raised her voice. She never showed off. When she was uncertain about something, she said so, which turned out to be the most disorienting thing of all, because Nathan had learned to expect people to pretend more certainty than they had, and Eleanor didn't. I'm not sure whether the section near the old irrigation ditch is infected or just dry, she said one evening, standing at the edge of the field while the sun went down behind them. I don't want to burn it unnecessarily. Can we wait 3 days and watch it? We can wait, Nathan said. She nodded. She stood there a moment longer, looking at the field. You knew, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. I thought I knew. There's a difference. But you were certain enough to say something? She turned and looked at him. The evening light was doing something to her face that made her look for a moment like someone he hadn't quite seen before. Someone had to, she said simply. They saved 60% of the northeast field. Under any other circumstances, that would have felt like a loss. But Hatch told Nathan that without Eleanor's early intervention, they'd have likely lost the entire section and possibly infected the south fields as well. The math was not complicated. Nathan sat with his ledger that night and ran the numbers. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Declan knocked on the office door around 9 o'clock. You alive in there? Come in. Declan came in, saw Nathan's face, and sat down in the chair across the desk. She knew what she was talking about, Nathan said. I expect she knew that before you did. Nathan said nothing. She say anything about it about being right? No. Declan leaned back in his chair and looked at his boss. Nathan, what exactly did you write in that letter to the agency? You read it. I know what I read. I want to know if you know what you wrote. Nathan looked down at the desk. I wrote that I wanted someone quiet and obedient. And instead, you got someone competent. I'm aware of the difference. Are you? Declan tilted his head. Because I've been watching her work for 2 weeks, and the word I keep coming back to isn't quiet. It's careful. She's careful. There's a difference between a woman who has nothing to say and a woman who chooses what to say. And I don't think you knew which one you were asking for. Nathan didn't answer. Because Declan was right. And the terrifying thing, the thing Nathan couldn't yet put a name to, was that somewhere in the past 2 weeks in the fields and the evening light and the quiet moments of honest work, alongside someone who simply knew things, something had shifted. He hadn't asked for a partner. He was beginning to understand that he might have needed one all along. Outside, the plains of Wyoming stretched out dark and wide, and the wheat, what remained of it, stood waiting in the summer night. And Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor Reed sat at the kitchen table with his ledger books open in front of her. Running numbers he hadn't asked her to run, finding errors he hadn't known were there, saying nothing, seeing everything. And Nathan, for the first time in a very long time, did not know what to do with the feeling that was growing in his chest. He suspected it might be something close to respect. He also suspected somewhere deeper that it might be something considerably more frightening than that. The ledger errors were not small. That was the first thing Nathan understood when Eleanor set the books in front of him the following morning. 3 columns of figures marked in her neat, deliberate handwriting alongside his own rougher numbers. She hadn't announced what she'd found. She hadn't come to him with an expression of triumph or accusation. She had simply placed the open ledger on the breakfast table beside his coffee cup and sat down across from him and waited. Nathan looked at the numbers. He looked at hers. He looked back at his. These are from the past 3 years, he said. Yes. You went through 3 years of books in one night. I couldn't sleep. She said it without apology. I find numbers calming. And your records were accessible on the shelf. He stared at the page a moment longer. How much? In overcharges from your grain supplier, roughly $412 over 36 months. In payroll calculation errors, I believe honest mistakes, not theft, another 60 or so. And there's a fence repair invoice from 2 summers ago that was paid twice. She turned the ledger slightly so he could see more clearly. That one is $230. Nathan sat back in his chair. Over $600. In errors. Sitting in his books for 3 years. Why didn't you just tell me? He asked. Why put it on the table like this? Because I thought you'd want to see it for yourself, rather than take my word for it, she said. Men generally do. There was no sharpness in it. It was simply an observation stated with the same calm she brought to everything. And somehow, that made it land harder than if she'd said it with an edge. Nathan closed the ledger, opened it again, closed it. I'll need to speak with Morrison at the grain office, he said. I'd recommend taking the original invoices. I've marked the relevant ones. He looked at her. You marked them already. Last night. They're in the envelope on top of the ledger. She rose and poured him more coffee without asking if he wanted it. I also noticed your seed purchase contracts expire at the end of August. If you're planning to renegotiate, this would be the right time to do it before the fall buying season drives the prices up. Nathan accepted the coffee. He didn't say anything for a moment. Eleanor. She stopped. Why did you agree to this arrangement? He asked. The agency. Coming here. You clearly have capabilities. You could have managed your own situation. She turned to look at him. Something moved behind her eyes, brief and considered. My brother sold the farm, she said. He had the legal right to do so. I had no claim, and a woman of 32 in Missouri in 1886 has a narrow set of options available to her, regardless of her capabilities. She paused. I chose the option that gave me a household to manage. I did not realize it would also include $600 in uncorrected accounting errors, but here we are. It was the longest speech she had made since arriving. And then she went back to washing the breakfast dishes, as if she hadn't said anything remarkable at all. Nathan rode to town that same afternoon and sat down with Gerald Morrison at the grain office. Morrison was a big man, florid-faced and jovial, in the practiced way of men who have spent decades negotiating from positions of advantage. He shook Nathan's hand with both of his and poured whiskey Nathan hadn't asked for. "Nathan, what brings you in early for seed season?" "Invoices," Nathan said. He put the envelope on the desk. "I've been reviewing the last 3 years of accounts." Morrison's smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. "That's so, find something of interest. $412 of interest approximately." A silence. Morrison picked up the envelope. He opened it with the deliberate slowness of a man deciding how to play his next hand. He looked at the marked invoices. He looked at the figures. He set them down. "Now, Nathan." "Gerald." Nathan leaned forward. "I've been buying from you for 11 years. I want to believe these are errors." "They are errors. Absolutely they are. Then we'll settle them as errors." Nathan's voice was even. "Full amount credited to my fall account. No lawyers, no conversation with the Territorial Grain Board." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer I look more carefully at your other accounts." Morrison's face reddened. Then slowly the color settled. "I'll have a credit drafted by end of week," he said. "By Thursday," Nathan said. "Thank you, Gerald." He rode home with $400 effectively recovered from 3 years of quietly drained profit and the curious sensation that he was seeing his own farm differently than he had 4 weeks ago, as if someone had cleaned the glass he'd been looking through. Word moves fast in small territories. By the following week, it was no longer just Hatch and Cody who knew that Nathan Reed's new wife had identified the fungal outbreak. Neighboring farmers had noticed the burn lines in the northeast field, and when they came to ask about it, Nathan told them the truth. Eleanor had spotted it first. He hadn't intended it as a public endorsement. It was simply the honest answer. But honest answers have consequences. The first man to show up at the farmhouse door was a rancher named Walt Briggs, who ran a smaller wheat operation 3 miles east. He was hat-in-hand polite, which was not his usual manner, and he got to the point with the directness of a man who has decided something costs less than his pride. "Mrs. Reed, I got some yellowing in my south field. Noticed it 2 days ago. My man Ortega says it's just dry season, but I wondered if you'd be willing to take a look." Eleanor was at the door for about 4 seconds before she said, "Give me 20 minutes to finish the bread dough. I'll come with you." She didn't ask Nathan. She didn't look at Nathan. Nathan, standing in the hallway behind her, had a brief and confusing experience of feeling proud and annoyed at the same time. She went to Briggs's farm. She walked his south field. She came home 2 hours later and told Nathan at dinner that Briggs's yellowing was in fact just dry season. No fungal indicators. Different pattern entirely, and that she'd advised him on irrigation adjustment. "He offered to pay you," Nathan guessed. "He offered to bring a ham next week." A pause. "I told him that wasn't necessary, but he seemed determined." "And you didn't think to mention this to me before you went?" Eleanor looked at him. "Should I have—" "You're my wife." "Yes," she said. "And Walt Briggs asked for help with a farming problem I could address. I didn't realize I needed to submit a request." Nathan set down his fork. Eleanor held his gaze without flinching, without apology, without the careful retreat he was accustomed to seeing in people when he used that particular tone. It was Declan's voice in his head from 2 weeks ago. A woman who has nothing to say versus a woman who chooses what to say. He picked up his fork again. "Next time," he said, "tell me first." "If it's convenient," she agreed, which was not quite the same as agreeing. Walt Briggs brought the ham. He also brought his neighbor, a man named Fowler, who had questions about his seed rotation. And Fowler mentioned Eleanor's name to the postmaster's wife, who mentioned it to the Methodist congregation, and within 3 weeks of that first visit, Eleanor had become, without seeking it, Without announcing it, and without Nathan's explicit blessing, the most frequently consulted person on agricultural matters within a 10-mile radius. Nathan found out the full scope of it on a Thursday morning when he came into the kitchen to find two women he'd never seen before sitting at his kitchen table, both of them listening intently, while Eleanor sketched a soil rotation diagram on the back of a flour sack. He stopped in the doorway. The two women looked up. Eleanor looked up. "Mr. Reed," she said. "This is Mrs. Petrov and her daughter Anna. They're having trouble with their potato crop." She said it the way you'd say, "This is the mail," or "The coffee is ready." A simple fact in a simple world. "Good morning," Nathan said, because there didn't seem to be anything else to say. He ate his breakfast standing up at the counter, while the three women talked soil alkalinity and drainage at his kitchen table, and he had the unsettling feeling that something about his household had changed in a way he hadn't authorized and couldn't quite object to. Later he found Declan leaning on the fence post near the barn, watching the Petrov women's wagon roll back toward the road. "Don't say anything," Nathan said. "I was going to say she's good," Declan said mildly. "I know she's good." "Do you?" Declan pushed off the fence post. "Because you look like a man who's not sure whether to be grateful or offended, and those are two different problems with two different solutions." Nathan said nothing. "She's not doing anything wrong, boss." "I know that." "She's not doing anything behind your back either. She's just—" Declan tilted his head slightly. "She's just being herself, and I don't think you've figured out yet whether that's what you wanted or not." Maktoa. The storage barn problem surfaced in July. It was Hatch who brought it to Eleanor first, which Nathan only found out afterward, and which should have irritated him more than it did. Hatch was not a man who went to women with farming problems. He'd been raised in a time and culture that simply didn't allow for it. But 3 months of watching Eleanor's judgment prove consistently correct had apparently done something to his habits. "The storage loss is higher than it should be," Hatch told her one morning at the barn door. "We're losing more to moisture and heat than the numbers should account for. Been happening for 2 seasons. Eleanor walked into the storage barn and spent 2 hours in it. When she came out, she sat down with Hatch and Cody at the barn table and told them exactly what was wrong. The organization of the storage system, which Nathan had designed himself years ago, was creating airflow problems. Grain stacked in a particular sequence was trapping moisture at the center of the bulk. The oldest grain was buried deepest, meaning it deteriorated before it was used. The ventilation spacing between pallets was wrong by a matter of inches, but those inches over weeks and months added up to significant spoilage loss. Hatch listened. Then he said, "How do you fix it? Restack everything in this sequence." She sketched it out. Rotate oldest to the outside. Add 2 additional air channels here and here. And we need to recheck the roof seam on the east side. There's a moisture entry point I think about 8 feet from the northeast corner. Something is getting in. Cody found the roof seam the next morning. She'd been right about the 8 feet. When Nathan learned all of this, he didn't hear it from Eleanor. He heard it from Cody, who mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. Nathan walked to the storage barn and looked at the restacked grain. He stood there for a while. Then he walked to the house and found Eleanor making preserves in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, working with the focused efficiency she brought to every physical task. "The storage barn," he said. "Yes." She didn't look up. "I should have spoken to you first. You're right about that. I'll remember it." "When were you planning to tell me?" "This evening." She set the jar down and finally looked at him. "I was going to show you the projected savings in spoilage cost over the next 12 months. I've been working out the numbers." A pause. "It's significant." "How significant?" She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the paper from the counter beside her. She handed it to him. Nathan looked at the number at the bottom. He looked at it for a long time. "Per season," she confirmed. He put the paper down on the counter carefully, as if it might break. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to ask you something." "All right." "In Missouri, before the agency, what exactly were you doing?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair from the kitchen table and sat down. And he understood without being told that this was going to be a longer answer than he'd expected. After my father died, she said, I was 24. My brother Marcus was 17. The farm was in debt. My father was a brilliant scientist and a careless businessman. I spent 8 years restructuring the operation. I built relationships with the county agricultural extension. I negotiated new contracts with 3 different suppliers. I trained 2 sets of farm workers. She paused. In the last year before Marcus came of age and took legal ownership, I turned a net loss into a profitable operation. Nathan sat down across from her. And then he sold it, Nathan said. He sold it 6 months after he turned 21. He wanted to go to Denver. He was entitled to. It was his. Something flickered across her face, not bitterness exactly. More like the scar left behind after bitterness has finished its work. I had no legal claim. I had no savings because everything I'd earned went back into the farm. I had skills that no one in Missouri was particularly interested in paying a woman to use. She looked at him steadily. So I wrote to the agency. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. You wrote a letter describing yourself as mild-tempered and content with domestic life, he said slowly. I wrote what the agency's application form requested. She paused. I am mild-tempered. I am content with domestic life. Those things are also true. Nathan looked at her for a long time. He thought about the 4 days he'd waited to act on the fungal warning. He thought about $600 in ledger errors. He thought about the storage barn and the spoilage loss and the women at his kitchen table and Hatch going to her first. He thought about the letter he'd written. I do not require education or ambition. I require reliability and a quiet nature. He had written that. He had meant it. And he had gotten a woman who was quietly, reliably, methodically saving his farm from the inside out and doing it without asking for recognition, without making demands, without calling attention to any of it. Not because she was weak, because she understood with the precision of someone who had been underestimated her entire life that the work itself was the argument. That result spoke louder than anything she could say, that the most dangerous position to be in was the one nobody was watching. Nathan had spent years believing that a quiet woman was a simple woman. He was starting to understand that he had never been more wrong about anything. The last week of July brought the first hint of the disaster that was coming, though nobody recognized it as such yet. A neighboring farmer named Caldwell rode over on a Wednesday afternoon, and Nathan could see from 100 yards away that the man was rattled. Caldwell was not a rattleable man. He'd survived a prairie fire and 2 bank panics and lost 3 sons to various Western misfortunes, and he moved through the world with the slow, implacable steadiness of someone who had decided there was nothing left that could genuinely surprise him. He was surprised now. Nathan! He pulled up at the porch. You hearing anything from the farms up north? Not this week. Why? Caldwell's jaw worked for a moment. Hargrove's entire east field, gone. 600 acres of wheat, and he lost it in 3 weeks. Said it started like yours yellowing at the tips, but by the time he knew what he was looking at, it was already through half his crop. Nathan went still. Who else? 2 operations past Hargrove. There's talk of more further north up near the Nebraska line. Caldwell looked at Nathan steadily. Whatever you did that burn line in your northeast section, whatever stopped it from spreading here, you might want to start thinking about how to help your neighbors figure out the same thing. Nathan nodded. Caldwell rode away. Nathan stood on the porch and looked out at his fields for a long moment. Then he turned and went inside. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She had already heard she had been at the window, and Caldwell's voice had carried. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when she had already done the analysis and was waiting to be asked. You know what this is? He said. I think so, she said. I've been reading everything I could find about regional outbreaks. If it's moving north to south along the creek watersheds, and it will, that's how it spreads. We have at most 4 to 6 weeks before it's in every farm within 30 miles of the Platte. Nathan looked at her. All of them? He asked. All of them, she said. unless someone does something different from what anyone is doing now. The clock on the wall ticked, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen of a farm she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't entirely planned, with a husband who had ordered a quiet wife and gotten something he didn't have a word for yet, and looked at him with the clear, steady gaze of someone who already knew what needed to be done. She was waiting to see if he did too. Nathan said, "Tell me the plan. Not do you have a plan. Not what do you think we should do." He said, "Tell me which was the first time in their 4 months of marriage that he had spoken to her like someone whose answer he was already prepared to trust." Eleanor noticed. She didn't remark on it. She simply pulled the chair out from the kitchen table and sat down, and Nathan sat across from her, and she began. "The blight moves through water contact and wind-carried spores," she said. "It follows creek drainage patterns because the moisture accelerates the cycle. If Hargrove's East Field is already gone and the 2 operations north of him are showing signs, then we're looking at a southward progression that will hit the Platte Basin farms within the month." She spread her hands flat on the table. "You can't stop it farm by farm. Each farmer fighting alone is going to lose. The only way to slow it, maybe stop it, is to treat the entire corridor at once." "Treat it how?" "Coordinated burn lines between every affected and at-risk section. Emergency irrigation channels redirected to create dry barriers where the creek drainage is carrying the spores. And crop separation? The farms that have already lost sections need to isolate their remaining healthy wheat immediately, not in a week. Not when they're sure now." She paused. "And someone needs to ride to every farm in the affected corridor and make sure they understand what they're looking at and what they need to do." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's 30-40 farms," he said. "Maybe more." "Yes. Some of those men have never cooperated on anything in their lives." "Yes. And you want to be the one to talk to them." Eleanor met his eyes. "I want us to talk to them. You have the standing in this community that I don't. But I know the science. We'd be stronger together." A pause. "We usually are." It was the first time she had said anything that sounded like a claim on what they were to each other. Nathan heard it land between them and didn't quite know what to do with it. "All right," he said. "In the morning." "Tonight," she said. "Caldwell lives 4 miles east. If we ride to him tonight and get his agreement, he'll bring 3 other farmers with him tomorrow. He has that kind of influence. Starting with him isn't just efficient, it's strategic." Nathan stared at her. Then he pushed back his chair and reached for his hat. Caldwell opened his door at 8 o'clock in the evening to find Nathan Reed and his wife on his porch, and his expression said plainly that he had not expected the wife. "Mrs. Reed," he said, politely, uncertainly. "Mr. Caldwell." Eleanor didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past him with the focused energy of someone who has too much to do to stand on ceremony. "I apologize for the hour. We need to talk about your north field drainage and your neighbor Fowler's irrigation channels, and I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you in time to act on it tomorrow morning." Caldwell looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "I'd listen to her." Caldwell listened. He was quiet through most of it, the kind of quiet that isn't indifference, but deep, uncomfortable attention, the kind that comes when a man is hearing something that is rearranging what he thought he knew. His wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, came in from the back room partway through and stood in the doorway and also listened. When Eleanor finished, Caldwell was silent for a long moment. "If we burn the barrier lines you're describing," he said slowly, "we're talking about deliberate destruction of healthy crop, as insurance against something that might spread or might not." "It will spread," Eleanor said. "The pattern from Hargrove's field is unambiguous. The question isn't whether it comes south. The question is whether it finds barriers when it does." "That's your assessment?" "Yes." Another silence. Ruth Caldwell spoke from the doorway. "Daniel." Her husband looked at her. "She saved Reed's northeast field, Hatch told me, and Hatch doesn't talk about women knowing farming." Caldwell's jaw worked. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man making a decision that costs him something. "I'll ride to Fowler and Briggs and Patterson at first light," he said. "I'll tell them you're coming. They'll listen to me long enough to hear you out." He paused. "After that, what they decide is their own business." "That's all I'm asking," Eleanor said. On the ride home, Nathan didn't speak for the first mile. Then he said, "Ruth Caldwell said that about Hatch." "I heard her." "Hatch told half the county, apparently." "Apparently." A beat. "Is that a problem?" Nathan thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." The next 10 days were the hardest work Nathan Reed had done since his first year breaking sod on the Platte. They rode together every morning. Eleanor talked. Nathan backed her up. The reactions were as varied as the men they visited. Fowler listened carefully and agreed by the end of the first hour. Briggs had already seen new yellowing in his east section and needed almost no convincing. Patterson was polite and skeptical and told them he'd think about it. A man named Garfield shut his door in their faces. A man named Healy listened to Eleanor for 20 minutes and then said with the particular carefully calibrated politeness that is more dismissive than rudeness, "I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Reed. I'll speak with my foreman about it." Eleanor said, "Your foreman isn't going to recognize stage 2 blight until it's already in your healthy sections. I'm telling you what I see right now today. If you'd like me to walk your fields with you, I can show you exactly what to look for." Healy smiled. "That won't be necessary." They rode away from Healy's farm, and Eleanor stared straight ahead at the road for a full minute without speaking. "Eleanor," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "Not everyone will. He's a fool. He's a frightened man who would rather believe a woman is wrong than accept that he's in danger he can't control." She was quiet for a moment. "I've met a great many men like that in my life. It doesn't get less frustrating." Nathan looked at the side of her face. "How do you stay so calm about it?" She turned to look at him, and something passed through her expression that was more honest than her usual composure. "I don't," she said quietly. "I just wait until I'm somewhere private." It was such a plain human admission that Nathan felt something catch in his chest. He turned back to the road before she could see it on his face. By the end of the first week, 14 farms had agreed to Eleanor's plan. 6 had refused. 7 were still undecided. Then the reports from Nebraska started coming in. A messenger came from the Territorial Agricultural Office on a Thursday, carrying a letter addressed to no one in particular, a general warning dispatched to county offices across Wyoming and Nebraska about a fast-moving crop blight decimating wheat operations. The letter recommended monitoring and isolation of affected sections. It did not describe what Eleanor had already been implementing for 2 weeks. Nathan read the letter at the kitchen table that evening. He read it twice. "They're 3 weeks behind," he said. "At least," Eleanor said. "By the time official guidance reaches farmers through the county office, the planting season will be past saving. The farms that refuse to cooperate will suffer for it," she said. It wasn't satisfaction in her voice. It was something harder and sadder than satisfaction. "Unless someone reaches them first." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan, there are farms 2 and 3 counties over that haven't heard anything yet. Not from us, not from the county office. They're going to lose everything and not understand why." He looked at her. "You want to go further?" "Someone has to." "Eleanor, that's—" He stopped. He thought about the distances she was describing, the territory, the number of farms. "That's hundreds of miles." "I know what it is. You'd be riding into counties where nobody knows you, where nobody has any reason to trust you." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking if you'll come with me." Nathan was silent for a long time. He thought about his farm, his fields, the harvest that was 6 weeks away. Everything he had built over 11 years that required his presence and attention. He thought about Healy's polite dismissal, Garfield's closed door. He thought about Hargrove's 600 acres, gone in 3 weeks. "How long?" he said. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. "Declan can manage here." "I know he can." Another silence. You already talked to Declan. Eleanor had the grace to look slightly abashed. Yesterday afternoon. I wanted to know if it was feasible before I asked you. Nathan looked at her. He should have been irritated. Instead, he found himself fighting something that felt dangerously close to admiration. You asked my foreman before you asked me, he said. I asked your foreman about logistics. I'm asking you about the decision. Is there a difference? Yes, she said simply. You're my husband. This affects our home and our life and our marriage. That's a different question than whether Declan can handle 2 weeks of field management. The word marriage sat between them for a moment. It was the second time in a week she had said something that claimed their life together as a real thing, not a transaction or an arrangement, but an actual shared life with weight and consequence. Nathan cleared his throat. We leave Saturday, he said.
Chatushe.
They left Saturday. What followed was unlike anything Nathan had expected, and he was not a man given to surprise. Eleanor rode like someone who had spent time in the saddle, not gracefully exactly, but with the no-nonsense competence she applied to everything. She could read a map and a terrain simultaneously. She knew when to push and when to rest. She carried her own weight without comment. And she talked to farmers. Nathan watched it happen farm after farm, county after county, and he couldn't fully describe it, except to say that Eleanor had a way of making a frightened man feel like the decision to act was his own idea. She didn't lecture. She didn't perform expertise. She asked questions first. How long have you been seeing this? What's your drainage situation on the east side? Which of your sections went in last? And by the time she started talking about what she'd seen and what worked, the man in front of her was already leaning forward. In Goshen County, a farmer named Strickland told her flatly that he didn't take advice from women, and she should send her husband in to talk properly. Nathan took a breath. Eleanor said, "Of course, Nathan," and then she stood beside him while Nathan repeated word for word exactly what she'd told him in the saddle an hour before: the drainage pattern, the isolation technique, the burn line positioning. He delivered it as clearly as he could, which was adequately, and Strickland nodded and said he'd get his men on it by Monday. They rode away from Strickland's farm, and Nathan said nothing for a moment. "Don't," Eleanor said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You had a particular expression. I was angry on your behalf." "I know." She glanced at him. "I've learned to save my energy. Strickland's wheat matters more than Strickland's manners. If your voice is what it takes to make him act, then your voice is what we use." A pause. "That's not weakness. That's strategy." Nathan rode in silence for a moment. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's a practical one," she said. "And I'm mostly a practical person." He looked at her. The road ahead was long and the sun was going down, and they were 2 days' ride from home in a county that was about to lose most of its harvest. "Mostly," he said. She was quiet for just a beat too long. "Mostly," she confirmed. The twist came on the 11th day. They were in Laramie County, 4 farms into the day, when they stopped at a general store to resupply and found 3 men deep in argument at the far end of the counter. Nathan recognized one of them, a county land agent named Schofield, a man he'd had minor dealings with over the years. The other 2 were strangers. Eleanor was already at the counter when Nathan heard the word blight. He stopped. Schofield was saying, in the particular calm voice of someone who has already made their decision and is explaining it to people who don't have power to change it. "The affected farms are going to default by winter if the harvest fails. The bank is already positioning for foreclosure on 6 properties in this county alone." One of the strangers said, "And the ones who survive. The survivors are going to find buyers for the failed land at reduced rates. It's a loss now, but a longer investment." Schofield's voice dropped slightly. "The key is making sure the panic doesn't drive early action that stabilizes the situation before the foreclosures are ready to move." Nathan felt the cold move through him. Eleanor was standing perfectly still at the counter. Schofield turned and saw them, and his face did something complicated. "Read," he said, with the careful pleasantness of a man recalculating. "Schofield." Nathan's voice was level. Interesting conversation. Business talk. Schofield smiled. You know how it is. Nathan looked at the two strangers. They had the well-dressed, travel-worn look of men who had come from somewhere else for a specific purpose. Neither of them introduced themselves. Neither of them looked comfortable. Eleanor turned from the counter. She looked at Schofield with the clear, direct gaze she used when she was seeing something she intended to remember. Mr. Schofield, she said. The farms in this county that are still savable, the ones with early-stage blight and good isolation potential, what's your timeline on those foreclosure positions? Dead silence. Schofield stared at her. I don't believe we've been introduced. Eleanor Reed. She said it without heat. I'm the person who's been riding this territory for 11 days teaching farmers how to save their crops. So I'm fairly familiar with which properties are currently in distress and which ones might not need to be. She paused. I'm also fairly familiar with what it sounds like when someone is hoping a crisis gets worse before it gets better. The two strangers looked at each other. Schofield's pleasant expression didn't waver, but his eyes went flat and still. Mrs. Reed, he said softly, you should be careful about what you think you've heard. I'm careful about most things, she said. It's a habit. She picked up her parcels from the counter. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at Schofield. The farms you're watching, she said, the ones you're waiting on. I'd move your timeline up. A pause. Because I'm not done writing yet. She walked out. Nathan stood for one moment, looking at Schofield's carefully controlled face, and at the two strangers, and at the way all three of them had just been made acutely aware that they'd been overheard by someone with the knowledge and reach to make that a problem for them. He turned and followed his wife out the door. On the boardwalk, he caught up with her in 3 steps. Eleanor, he said. I heard everything, she said quietly. They're using the blight, or trying to, letting the panic run so they can buy failed land cheap. She was walking fast, not from fear, from fury, contained and precise. They're not causing it, but they're counting on it. Schofield has connections with the Territorial Bank. I know. I've been reading the county land records in every general store we've stopped at. She said it simply, as if reading county land records at every general store was a normal thing a person did. 6 properties in Laramie County, 4 in Goshen, 2 more in Carbon, all of them held by farmers who are in the direct path of the blight corridor. Nathan stopped walking. How long have you been tracking this? She stopped too, turned to face him. And for the first time since he'd met her, Eleanor Reed looked like something had gotten through her composure, not broken it, but gotten through enough that the heat of it showed in her face. Since the 3rd farm, she said, when I saw that 2 of the properties nearest the worst affected sections had liens filed in the last 60 days. She looked at him. Someone knew this was coming before we did, Nathan. Or at least knew it was possible, and they positioned for it. The implications landed one by one. 6 farms in this county alone, families, children, land that men had broken their bodies building, being watched like a market investment. What do we do? Nathan asked. Eleanor looked back toward the store, toward the road, toward the wide and complicated territory still ahead of them. We ride faster, she said. And the fury in her eyes was not loud, not theatrical, not the kind that burned itself out quickly. It was the quiet, permanent load-bearing kind. The kind that builds things. The kind that doesn't stop. They rode faster. Eleanor was not exaggerating when she said it, and Nathan understood within the first hour that she'd meant it literally. They cut their stops shorter. They slept less. They pushed the horses harder, and themselves harder, and in the evenings, instead of stopping at the nearest inn, Eleanor would sit at whatever table was available. A farmhouse kitchen, a store counter twice the tailgate of their own wagon and right. She wrote to farmers they hadn't reached yet. She wrote to county agricultural offices with specific technical language that Nathan could see was designed to be impossible to dismiss or file away. She wrote to 2 men she referred to simply as colleagues of my father's, without elaborating. And Nathan did not ask, because by this point he had learned that Eleanor's network of knowledge was considerably wider and deeper than anything she'd advertised. On the 14th day, Nathan wrote a letter of his own. He wrote it to the territorial governor's office. He described what he'd seen in the field, what Eleanor's methods had achieved, and what he'd overheard in Schofield's conversation at the general store. He signed it with his full name and his farm's registered acreage, both of which carried more weight in official correspondence than he was entirely comfortable admitting. He didn't tell Eleanor until after he'd sent it with the Morning Post writer. She found out at breakfast and looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "You sent a letter to the governor," she said. "I did. About Schofield. About all of it. The blight corridor, the farms, the coordination work you've been doing. And Schofield." He met her eyes. "What we heard in that store was land fraud positioning Eleanor. Maybe legal technically, but not if it can be shown that the panic was being deliberately allowed to run. You said ride faster. I'm riding in the directions I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." It was simple, no elaboration. But her voice had a texture to it that Nathan hadn't heard before, something slightly unguarded, and he understood that it cost her something to receive help as directly as she was being offered it. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's my territory too." They reached the last farm on Eleanor's list on the 17th day. A man named Colby, 61 years old, who had been farming the same 300 acres since before Wyoming was a territory. He was exactly the kind of man Nathan would have expected to be their hardest conversation. Old proud, deeply set in his methods, deeply suspicious of anyone arriving with advice he hadn't asked for. But when they pulled up to Colby's farm, he was already standing in his yard waiting for them. Not because he'd been warned they were coming. He hadn't been. He was standing in his yard because 3 of his neighbors had ridden to him the previous day to tell him about the woman traveling the territory and what she'd shown them and what had worked. Word had moved faster than they had. Colby looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "You the one who's been riding?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "My neighbor Hess says you saved 60% of his south field." "Mr. Hess acted quickly," Eleanor said. "That saved his field. I just told him what to look for." Colby chewed on that for a moment. "My daughter farms a section east of here. Husband's not much good at it. She's been managing most of it herself for 3 years." "Is that so?" Eleanor said. "She'd want to meet you." He said it like a fact, not a question. Like it had already been decided somewhere and he was just catching up to it. "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." Nathan watched Eleanor follow Colby through the door and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in the middle of a crisis, in a county 4 days' ride from home. He felt proud. Not the anxious, complicated pride he'd felt back in June, watching her work his fields, the pride that was mixed with resistance and uncertainty. Something cleaner. Something that didn't need to qualify itself. He tied the horses and went inside. They started back on the 18th day. The ride home was quieter than the ride out, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the transactional silence of 2 people who haven't yet decided what to make of each other, but something with more ease in it, more familiarity. On the second evening of the return journey, they stopped at a small inn and had dinner at a table by the window, and for the first time in 18 days, they didn't talk about blight or drainage or land fraud or burn lines. Nathan talked about the farm he'd inherited and what it had looked like the first winter. Eleanor talked about her father, what it was like to grow up following a scientist through test fields, how he used to explain everything as if she had the same mind he did, which she'd understood only much later was an extraordinary gift. "He never told you that you couldn't," Nathan said. "No." She smiled. It was a different smile from the small controlled ones he'd seen at the kitchen table. This one went all the way to her eyes. "He told me I'd have to be twice as thorough and twice as patient and 3 times as sure before anyone would believe me. But he never said I couldn't." "He was right about the thorough part," Nathan said. I've never seen anyone do what you've done these past 3 weeks. Eleanor looked at him. The smile softened into something quieter. I've never had anyone ride with me, she said. The inn was warm and the evening was settling in outside, and Nathan didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't try to find one. He just sat with it, which felt like the right thing to do. They arrived home on a Thursday evening to find Declan on the porch looking like a man waiting with news. Nathan felt his chest tighten before he'd climbed down from the wagon. The fields. Fields are fine, Declan said. Better than fine, actually. We had good rain last week, and the rotation sections are coming in strong. He paused. But you've got company. What kind of company? The kind that arrived in a government wagon with a territorial seal on the side. Declan glanced at Eleanor. And they asked for Mrs. Reed by name. The two men in Nathan's front room were from the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Office. Their names were Marsh and Creel Marsh, soft-spoken and academic-looking Creel older and more direct. They'd been waiting for 4 hours and didn't seem to resent it. Marsh stood when Eleanor walked in and extended his hand in the manner of someone who had been thinking about what to say and had decided to start with action rather than words. Mrs. Reed, he said. We've been following the reports from the county offices across the affected corridor, and the letters from the farmers. He paused. There are quite a few letters. Eleanor shook his hand. How many farms in the affected corridor? Currently 42 showing active blight signs. 17 of those implemented the isolation and burn protocol you described. He looked at her directly. Of those 17, 14 are projecting viable harvest yields. Reduced, but viable. Eleanor nodded. Nathan could see her doing the math quickly. And the 25 who didn't implement? Marsh's expression answered before his words did. Significant losses. Several are going to be catastrophic. The room was quiet for a moment. Creel, the older man, spoke. Mrs. Reed, the governor's office received a letter from your husband about the situation in Laramie County, about a land agent named Schofield, and some positioning he may have been doing in anticipation of farm failures. Eleanor glanced at Nathan. We're looking into it, Creel said. I won't say more than that right now, but I want you to know it's being taken seriously. He looked at her steadily. As is everything else you've done. I'd like to know, Eleanor said carefully, what everything else means in this context. Marsh cleared his throat. The Agricultural Office is preparing a regional report on the blight and the response to it. We'd like your methods documented formally. The burn line protocols, the isolation sequences, the irrigation barrier system. He paused. We'd also like to know if you'd be willing to present your findings at the Regional Agricultural Conference in Cheyenne in November. Eleanor was very still for a moment. Nathan watched her face. He could see the calculation happening, not ambition exactly, but something more complex than that. The careful assessment of someone who had been dismissed her entire professional life, weighing the cost and the value of stepping into a room where she would be seen. Would I be presenting to farmers? She asked. Farmers, county agents, extension workers, territorial officials. Marsh paused. It would be a significant audience. Then yes, Eleanor said. I'll present. After Marsh and Creel left, Nathan found Eleanor in the kitchen, doing what she always did when she needed to think making something. This time, it was bread her hands working the dough with the steady rhythm he'd come to associate with her internal processing. He leaned in the doorway. Cheyenne, he said. November, she agreed. That's the territorial capital. Agricultural Conference in November draws people from 3 states. I know what it draws. You're not nervous. She didn't answer immediately. I'm always nervous, she said finally. I just don't let it make decisions for me. Nathan watched her work the dough. Outside the farm was quiet. The good quiet of working land in the early evening, the sounds of animals settling in, and crops standing in the late summer air. His farm, his land, and his kitchen, where his wife was standing at the counter, having just been asked to speak at the most significant agricultural gathering in the territory. "The agency letter," he said. "The one I wrote. You asked me once why I wrote what I wrote." Eleanor's hands slowed. "I said I wanted someone quiet because I was afraid," he said, "of what it felt like when a woman had ideas I hadn't prepared for. Clara Whitfield took something from me, and I decided the lesson was to want less." He stopped. That was wrong. The kitchen was very quiet. "Nathan, let me finish." He moved from the doorway and sat down at the table, not across from her, but beside the counter where she was standing close enough for her to hear him clearly without needing to raise his voice. "I didn't know what I was asking for when I wrote that letter. I thought quiet meant safe. I thought uncomplicated meant good. I had a whole theory about what kind of marriage I could manage, and every piece of it was wrong." He paused. "What I have instead is a woman who caught a fungal outbreak before it destroyed my farm, recovered $600 in lost income, reorganized my storage operation, rode 4 counties in 3 weeks, teaching strangers how to save their harvest, and apparently is now being asked to speak to the territory about it." Eleanor had stopped working the dough entirely. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said. "And I'm aware that's not a small thing to say. But it's accurate, and you deserve an accurate statement more than you deserve a pretty one." Eleanor turned from the counter. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked with the same careful, unhurried attention she brought to everything, as if she was reading him the way she read a field, looking for what was real beneath the surface, looking for what needed attention, looking for what could be trusted. "The letter you sent to the governor," she said slowly. "You didn't tell me first." "No, I did it and told you after. That bothered me for about an hour," she said. "And then I realized it was the first time anyone had acted on my behalf without being asked to." Nathan held her gaze. "It won't be the last," he said. The weeks between their return and the first hard frost were the busiest of Nathan's farming life, and also, in a way, he couldn't precisely name the best. The harvest came in strong. Not perfect, the northeast field still bore the evidence of the early burn lines, the ghost geometry of Eleanor's intervention, mapped in the crop yields, but strong enough, and the south and west sections were some of the best Nathan could remember. Neighboring farms told different stories. Briggs came by in early October, hat in hand, looking both relieved and chastened. "Made half what I should have," he said. "But that's better than nothing, which is what Garfield got." He shook his head. "Garfield lost everything. Bank's already talking to him." Nathan thought of Schofield, of the 2 well-dressed strangers in the general store, of Eleanor's voice steady and quiet. Someone knew this was coming. "Schofield," he said. Briggs's expression darkened. "Word is the territorial office is looking at him. Something to do with the lien filings." He paused. "Heard your wife's name came up in connection with that." "She tends to come up," Nathan said. Briggs almost smiled. "She does." He paused. "Nathan, what exactly did you ask for when you wrote to that agency?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Something I've been revising my opinion on." Briggs looked at him with the expression of a man who understood more than he was saying. "She's going to Cheyenne." "In November. Half the county's planning to go hear her." Briggs paused. "Other half's embarrassed they'll have to admit she told them so." Nathan shook his head slowly. "She's not going to tell them so." "What's she going to tell them?" "What she always tells them," Nathan said. "What she saw, what works, and how to do it themselves." The letter from the Cheyenne conference arrived 2 weeks before November. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Reed, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the second line of the address, printed carefully beneath her name, Consulting Agricultural Specialist, Platte River Basin District. It was a title no one had asked her about. No one had offered it to her. Someone in the territorial office had simply created it, attached it to her name, and printed it on official correspondence as if it had always existed. Eleanor stood at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands. Nathan watched her read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table very carefully, The way she'd set down that first ledger 6 months ago, as if it contained something that needed to be handled gently. "Consulting agricultural specialist," she said. "Appears so. They made that up." "They did. They made it up and put it on official correspondence." "Yes." She looked at him. Her face was doing something complicated. The composure was still there, but underneath it something was moving. Not breaking through, just moving the way ground shifts before the spring thaw. "Nathan," she said quietly, "what did your letter say?" "Exactly." He'd kept the copy. He went to the office and came back and handed it to her. She read it. He watched her read it, and this time he didn't look away because he wanted to see. In the letter, he had described her methods in technical detail. He had described the farms she'd reached and what they'd achieved. He had described Schofield's conversation and its implications. And in the final paragraph he had written, "My wife Eleanor Reed has more practical agricultural knowledge than any man currently advising this territory. She has demonstrated this not through argument, but through results repeatedly under difficult conditions and without recognition or compensation. I am writing to ensure that changes." Eleanor put the letter down. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she looked up at Nathan and said, "You did this." "I told the truth," he said. "Someone needed to say it in the right room." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, not tentatively, not with any of the careful distance that had characterized the first months of their arrangement, but fully the way a person holds on to something they've decided is real and worth holding. Nathan held on back. Outside, the Wyoming autumn was hard and clear and cold, and 30 miles away, in the offices of the county seat, Schofield was answering questions he'd rather not have been asked. And in Cheyenne, an agricultural conference was preparing a speaking slot for a woman the territory was only beginning to understand. And in Nathan Reed's kitchen, something that had started as a transaction, a letter to an agency, a woman in a brown dress, 2 trunks, and a 30-mile drive in silence, had become somewhere in the long, difficult miles between a fungal outbreak and a general store in Laramie County, something else entirely. Something that had required both of them to build. Something neither of them had known they were building until it was already there. The conference in Cheyenne was scheduled for the 3rd week of November. In the 2 weeks before they left, Nathan noticed something he hadn't expected. Eleanor was preparing with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. Her notes organized, her case studies, documented her methods, written out in the clear, accessible language of someone who wanted to be understood, not admired. But beneath the preparation, something was different. She was quieter than usual. Not the watchful, observational quiet of her first weeks on the farm. Something more internal. He found her at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock one night, her papers spread in front of her, her pen still staring at the wall. "Eleanor." She didn't startle. She turned her head slowly. "I didn't hear you come down." "You've been sitting like that for 20 minutes. She looked down at her papers. "I've been trying to figure out how to start." Nathan sat down across from her. "The speech. The room," she said. "How to walk into that room." She was quiet for a moment. "I've talked to individual farmers. I've talked to small groups. The people in those conversations needed help and were willing to hear it. What's in that conference room in Cheyenne is different. Those are men who have built their careers on being the authorities, who have written the pamphlets and advised the county offices and set the standards." She paused. "And I'm going to stand in front of them and tell them the methods they've been recommending are inadequate. They are inadequate." "I know that." She looked at him. "But knowing something is true, and knowing how to say it in a room that doesn't want to hear it, those are 2 different skills." Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember what you told me when we rode away from Strickland's farm? When he made you stand in the yard and send me in to repeat your words back to him?" She smiled faintly. "I told you it was strategy. You told me the wheat mattered more than his manners." Nathan leaned forward. "Eleanor, those men in Cheyenne, some of them are going to be Strickland's. Some of them are going to make you feel the way that store in Laramie made you feel. and you are going to stand up there anyway because what you know is more important than how they feel about the person saying it." He paused. "You've been doing that your whole life. This is just a bigger room." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "You're quite different," she said slowly, "from the man who wrote that letter to the agency." "I had good reason to change." She picked up her pen. She looked at her notes. She began to write. Nathan went back to bed, and he was almost asleep when he heard her moving downstairs, the scratch of the pen steady and sure, and he thought that was about the best sound he'd heard in years. Yeah. They arrived in Cheyenne 2 days before the conference. The city felt different to Nathan than it had on his previous visits. Bigger, louder, more crowded, with men in good coats, carrying the specific posture of people who have traveled somewhere important for something important. The hotel lobby was full of them. Agricultural agents, county officials, extension men, 2 territorial legislators Nathan recognized from newspaper photographs. Eleanor walked through it all with her 2 trunks and her organized papers and her plain traveling dress, and nobody gave her a second look. Nathan noticed that. He noticed it, and the familiar irritation moved through him, and he said nothing, because Eleanor wouldn't have wanted him to. But he filed it away. The first evening, a reception was held in the hotel's main hall. Nathan attended because he was Nathan Reed, and he knew people there. Eleanor attended because she was presenting the following morning, and Marsh from the agricultural office had specifically asked them both. The reception was the first real test. A man named Dr. Harlan Voss introduced himself to Nathan within the first 10 minutes, a silver-haired academic type from the State Agricultural College, prominent enough that 3 separate people had pointed him out to Nathan on the way in. Voss was the author of the Standard Territorial Wheat Management pamphlet. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of authority Eleanor was about to contradict. "Reed," Voss said, shaking his hand. "Your farm's in the Platte Basin, isn't it? You had a near miss with the blight." "We did," Nathan said. "My wife caught it early." Voss's expression did something careful. "Yes, I heard there was a local response of some kind. Burn line protocol." "My wife developed it," Nathan said. "She's presenting it tomorrow morning." Voss looked across the room to where Eleanor was standing with Marsh talking. He had the look of a man deciding what category to put something in. "She's a farmer, your wife." "She's the most knowledgeable agricultural mind I've encountered," Nathan said. "And I've been farming for 15 years. Voss absorbed this. His expression didn't change, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. Not acceptance, not rejection, but the reluctant activation of genuine curiosity in a man who had enough intellectual integrity to respond to a direct claim. "I look forward to the presentation," he said, and Nathan thought he might actually mean it. The conference hall seated 200. There were, by Nathan's count as they walked in the next morning, roughly 173 men and 4 women, 2 of the women being wives accompanying their husbands, 1 being a county clerk, and Eleanor. She sat at the presenter's table at the front of the room with her papers in front of her and her hands folded on top of them and her face entirely composed. Nathan sat in the 3rd row, which was close enough to see her clearly. Marsh introduced her with a care that told Nathan he'd thought about the introduction, not overselling, not qualifying, just stating her name, her title, and what she'd done. 14 farms, viable yields from the majority. Methods documented and reproducible. The room listened with the polite evaluating attention of people waiting to be either impressed or confirmed in their skepticism. Eleanor stood. She did not start with an apology. She did not start with qualifications or acknowledgments of the distinguished men in the room, or any of the softening language Nathan had half expected. She started with numbers. 42 farms in the affected blight corridor. 17 implemented the isolation and barrier protocol. 14 of those 17 will make viable yields this season. 25 farms did not implement the protocol. Of those 25, 3 are facing foreclosure proceedings. 11 have losses exceeding 60%, and 6 lost their entire harvest. She paused. Those are the results. I'll spend the next 30 minutes explaining why. The room was very quiet. She talked for 32 minutes. Nathan watched the faces of the men around him change, not all of them, not dramatically, but in the incremental way that real information moves through a person who is genuinely listening. The skepticism didn't disappear, but it shifted. It started listening instead of just waiting. Voss, 2 rows ahead of Nathan, took notes. That was the moment Nathan noticed. The man's pen was moving. When Eleanor finished, there was a pause. The kind of pause a room makes when it's deciding what to do with something it hadn't prepared for. Then Voss raised his hand. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "your lateral spread barrier, the dry channel system. You're saying it works on creek drainage blight vectors. Does it scale? Can you apply it to a full watershed?" "That depends on topography and the water table depth," Eleanor said. "I've been developing a modified version for higher elevation drainage patterns that I haven't had the opportunity to test at scale yet. But theoretically, yes. You'd need more data." "I'd need another season," she said, "and cooperation across county lines, which is harder to get than the data." Something moved across Voss's face. It looked remarkably like respect. "I'd like to see your documentation," he said. "I brought copies," Eleanor said. "I left a set at the registration table." Nathan heard the man beside him say something under his breath. He turned. It was a county agent from Carbon County named Briley, who Nathan had met briefly the previous evening. Briley shook his head slowly. "She brought copies," he said, "to no one in particular, like a man acknowledging he'd been out-prepared." The questions ran for 40 minutes past the scheduled end of Eleanor's slot. Marsh twice attempted to move the conference to the next presenter, and twice the room collectively ignored him. The questions weren't all friendly. 2 men pushed back hard on Eleanor's burn line calculations, arguing the crop loss from the preemptive burns might not justify the protection they provided. Eleanor engaged with both of them directly, conceding one point, holding firm on another, asking a counter-question that put one of them back on his heels. She did not perform. She did not charm. She just answered clearly and accurately, and held her ground when she was right and adjusted when she wasn't. Afterward in the hall, Nathan was approached by more people than he'd talked to in the previous day's reception combined. But they weren't coming to talk to him. They were coming to reach Eleanor, who was surrounded by a group of 12 men, some of them the most senior agricultural figures in the territory, asking follow-up questions as she stood in the middle of the hallway with her notes tucked under one arm. Nathan stood slightly back and watched. A woman appeared at his elbow. It was Ruth Caldwell. He hadn't known she'd come, hadn't seen her at the reception. She had apparently made the 3-day journey to Cheyenne on her own and told no one. "Daniel didn't know I was coming," she said by way of explanation. "I wanted to hear her speak." "What did you think?" Ruth looked at Eleanor in the center of that circle of men and said, "I think my daughters should know her name." She paused. "I think everyone's daughters should."
Amen.
The twist that nobody had anticipated arrived on the second day of the conference. A reporter from the Cheyenne Leader had been present at Eleanor's presentation. His name was Carl Briggs, no relation to Walt, and he was young and ambitious and smart enough to understand that the story in front of him was not the blight and not the agricultural conference. The story was Eleanor. He approached Nathan first, which was a strategic mistake that Nathan was able to observe with some detachment. "Mr. Reed," he said, "Carl Briggs the leader. I'd like to speak with your wife." "Then you should ask her," Nathan said. "Of course." Briggs pivoted smoothly. "Mrs. Reed, I'd like to write a profile. Your methods, the work in the corridor, the conference presentation." Eleanor looked at him. "What's the angle?" Briggs blinked. He hadn't expected that question. Most people, Nathan had noticed, didn't ask reporters what the angle was. "Human interest," Briggs said. "Woman farmer. Unlikely background. Agricultural scientist's daughter with 8 years of farm management experience," Eleanor said. "That's not an unlikely background. That's precisely the right background. The angle you're looking for isn't unlikely. It's that the territory has been ignoring qualified people for years because of their gender, and a blight crisis happened to make the cost of that policy visible. She paused. That's the story. If you want to write it, I'll talk to you. Briggs stared at her for a moment. Then he pulled out his notebook. The article ran 4 days later under the headline, "The Farmer's Wife Who Saved the Harvest and What the Territory Failed to Learn Until It Was Almost Too Late." It was reprinted in 3 Nebraska papers and 1 in Colorado. It was the first time Eleanor's name appeared in print. It was not the last. The Schofield matter resolved itself in December, while snow was settling over the Platte Basin, and Nathan's wheat was safely in storage under the reorganized system Eleanor had designed. The territorial investigation found that Schofield had positioned liens on 7 properties in anticipation of blight-driven foreclosures using information obtained from early county office reports that were not yet public. It was not technically criminal under existing territorial law, but it was exactly the kind of thing that destroyed a reputation in a small territory where everyone knew everyone, and Schofield knew it. He resigned from the land agency in early December. 2 of the 7 properties he'd liened were eventually able to clear their debts because of viable harvest yields, viable because those farms had implemented Eleanor's protocol in the final weeks before harvest. Eleanor learned about Schofield's resignation from Marsh, who sent a brief letter. She read the letter at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Just that. 1 word." And then she went back to her work. Nathan looked at her. He thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in Laramie with 2 trunks and a still face and said barely a word for the first 2 weeks. He thought about what it had cost her to be that careful for that long in that many rooms. "Eleanor," he said, "does it feel like enough?" She considered the question seriously, which was what she always did with questions that deserved it. "No," she said. 7 families still had liens filed against them. 3 of them had terrible seasons regardless. Schofield losing his position doesn't fix that. She paused. But it's a consequence. And consequences matter. They make the next person calculate differently. Is that justice? It's a start, she said. Justice takes longer. In the spring, a letter arrived from the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural College. It was addressed to Eleanor to her title, Consulting Agricultural Specialist, and it proposed something Nathan had to read twice to fully take in. They were establishing a new agricultural extension program. Practical farm management, crop science, drought, and disease response. They wanted Eleanor to help develop the curriculum. They wanted her to teach, not advise, not consult. Teach. Nathan read the letter. He handed it to Eleanor. He watched her read it. She read it once. Then she set it flat on the table and put her hand on top of it and looked at it as if she needed a moment to believe it was real. "Eleanor," Nathan said. She looked up. "I want you to say yes," he said. "Before you start thinking about what it would require or how to make it work logistically, I want you to know that I want you to say yes." She looked at him with the expression she wore when something was moving in her that she hadn't prepared for. "It would mean time in town," she said. "Not every week, but regularly." "I know." "The farm?" "Has Declan," he said. "And by now it has systems that run because of what you built. It can sustain some of your attention being elsewhere." He paused. "It should sustain that. You built it to work. Let it work." She was quiet for a long moment. "When I came here," she said slowly, "I was trying to survive. I had skills no one wanted, and options that were mostly closed, and I picked the option that at least let me use my hands." She looked at the letter. "I did not expect to end up somewhere I wanted to stay." Nathan felt something lodge in his chest. "Is that what this is?" he said. "Somewhere you